The movie revolves around Nick Powell, a high school senior who is soon to graduate with flying colors. His father passed away abruptly a few years ago, after which his mother Diane took charge of pretty much everything. She collected herself together, steadied the finances, and started micromanaging the life of her son. Diane wants her son to have a safe, traditional career, but Nick, who excels in studies, is passionate about writing and literature. In fact, he wants to skip his graduation ceremony and go to London for a writer's workshop program. In other words, Nick lives on the goddamn edge. The scene then cuts to the Powell household, where a huge celebration is underway. The matriarch of the family, Diane Powell, gets up and gives a speech, recognizing her son's academic achievements. She then raises a toast in Nick's name and offers him a present with his name engraved on it. However, Nick doesn't look too chuffed up about this whole party arranged just to celebrate him. He walks away from the guests, grabs a slice of cake, and enters the garage. He sits next to a workbench and suddenly pulls a shotgun to his face. But all of these events turn out to be just a dream, as Nick soon wakes up, startled, in the morning. Shortly afterwards, he heads downstairs to the kitchen where his mother is sitting by the dining table. She has prepared 2 eggs and bacon in the shape of a smiley face for breakfast. Yep. Diane is busy reading the newspaper when Nick interrupts her. He asks whether she has thought about the writer's workshop in London. Rather dismissively, Diane replies that she doesn't need to think about it, as Nick already knows how she feels about the workshop. It is obvious that she wants her son to stay in America and focus on his career. After this bleak start to the day, Nick grabs his cycle and heads to school. It is revealed that he does homework for his fellow students in exchange for money. He hands one of his friends an assignment and makes himself a quick buck in the school's corridor. At the same time, Nick's best friend Peter Egan is being bullied by a gang of students in the boys' bathroom. The gang's leader is a ferocious girl named Annie Newton, who frequently involves herself in all manners of petty crime. She has sold a stolen phone to Peter a few days ago, and he had given half of the money at the time. Now she wants the rest of the cash, but Peter doesn't have a penny on him, and he threatens to cut off his finger if he doesn't give the money soon. She then leaves the bathroom, and her minions follow her.
Good one, Annie.
So rad.
During lunchtime, Nick approaches her group and offers to pay for the phone that his best friend bought from her. He puts a wad of cash on the table and asks Annie if that is enough. However, she doesn't respond kindly and tells him to mind his own business. Nick then bends down and tells Annie that she is an emotionally broken person. This expectedly offends the bully, and she tries to launch an attack on him. Moments later, both of them are reprimanded and taken to the principal's office. The headmaster inquires about the incident, and Nick jokingly responds that Annie finds him attractive, but the principal is in no mood for silliness and promptly tells Annie to go home. He then warns Nick not to waste time on people who have no future in front of them. Elsewhere, Annie returns to her flat, a messy, broken home where she lives with her stepmom, father, and a younger brother, Victor. Her stepmom is busy smoking and watching TV, ignoring all of her responsibilities. This enrages Annie, who berates her for not feeding Victor. She threatens her to get up from the couch and not spend the whole day blowing cigarettes. Stepmom complains to her husband, asking him to say something, but he agrees with Annie. Soon the couple starts arguing, and loud profanities can be heard throughout the house.
Stop blowing cigarettes. Stop blowing other dudes. There's no pleasing you.
But Annie seems to be used to it, so she simply feeds Victor and goes to her room. Later that night, Peter comes to Nick's house and the two friends have a conversation. Peter asks if Nick is going to the party that's being hosted by one of their classmates. The latter responds that he won't, as he has somewhere else to go. Nick then hands him a book in which he has hidden a plane ticket to London. This finally makes Peter understand that his best friend is flying away to participate in the writer's workshop program. He asks if Mrs. Powell knows about this, and Nick replies that she doesn't. He claims that after his father passed away, his mother has suffocated him by planning his entire life in great detail. In the meantime, Annie goes out with her delinquent boyfriend, Marcus Bohem. They head downtown where Marcus breaks into an expensive-looking car. Annie ups the ante by shattering the window of a jewelry shop and stealing a lovely necklace from it. The duo then flees in the stolen car, likely to commit hit and runs for funsies, just as the cops arrive at the spot. The next morning, Annie prepares to head to school school after spending the night with her criminal boyfriend. Marcus asks her to leave the bag with the stolen jewelry, but it seems that she doesn't trust him all that much. This enrages Marcus so much that after she leaves, he informs the authorities about her crime. Sometime later, Annie reaches school and stores the stolen necklace in her locker. Peter, who is standing nearby, accidentally notices her doing so. He is about to get out of the way when Annie sees him staring towards her direction. Things begin to go bad when shortly afterwards the cops arrive at the school and arrest Annie for theft. They also break into her locker and discover the stolen jewelry. Annie later phones her lover and informs him that she has been arrested. He pretends to be innocent while she claims to know who snitched on her. Later, when Nick gets home, his mother informs him that the airline had called in. She reveals that his flight has been rescheduled, which makes it obvious that she now knows about his London trip. Panicked, Nick says that he can explain, but his mother seems disappointed by his actions. Later that night, Peter is headed to a house party when he is suddenly attacked by Annie and her group. She thinks that Peter was the one who snitched on her and wants to take revenge for it. Poor Peter is so nervous that he makes up a false story on the spot. Thinking that Nick is already on his flight to London, he lies that it was Nick who had informed the police about the whole thing. The scene then shifts to the house party where we see that Nick has changed his mind about going to London. In fact, he hands his ticket and hotel booking documents to a random girl at the party. He then leaves the house and goes for a walk, only to be followed by an old, beat-up car. It turns out that Annie and her goons are tailing him. As soon as he reaches a rather quiet stretch of road, they disembark from the vehicle and start beating him up. Pete is forced to watch on from inside the car as his best friend gets mercilessly kicked to the floor. Seconds later, Annie goes up to Nick and sarcastically asks him who is the broken one now. Nick snaps back and responds that she is still the emotionally broken one. This makes Annie incensed, and in a moment of madness, she kicks Nick with all her might. The poor guy then rolls down from the street and hits his head on a rock. The end. For Nick. Now panicking at their actions, one of the gang members checks on Nick, only to realize that he is barely breathing. The group is terrified that they might have just become a part of a murder. Annie suddenly comes to her senses and orders her henchmen to pick Nick up. They reluctantly do so and carry him into the woods. During this process, Nick's watch falls to the ground, but nobody notices it. The group dumps his body in a storm drain, covers it, and then walks away. Following this harrowing incident, Annie decides to head to her boyfriend's home. She soon reaches there and immediately confesses to him that she killed Nick. She begs her boyfriend to help her come up with a credible story to cover the crime, but Marcus tries to kick her out as he's scared the police will get him too. Enraged by this betrayal, Annie reminds her boyfriend that she can reveal the location of all the cars he has stolen throughout the years. She then goes to the nearby bridge and burns her clothes underneath it. Meanwhile, in a shocking twist of events, a completely healthy and unscathed Nick emerges from the bushes the very next morning. He heads to his school, as usual, and tries to talk to his classmates. However, Nick soon realizes that no one can see or hear him. He even tries to create a commotion and throws a book at the nearby shelf, but there is no response from the class. Nick then heads to the principal's office, where he hears his mother on the phone. He tries to communicate with her, but his voice doesn't seem to go through. Confused and scared, Nick tries to run back home, only to be hit by a car in the middle of the road. A huge cargo truck then runs over him, but surprisingly, he comes out of both accidents unscathed. The teenager also realizes that none of the people walking on the street noticed him getting yeeted by the car. Shortly afterwards, Nick reaches home and sees his mother talking to the local police on the phone. He tries to grab her attention, but like everyone else, she doesn't hear or see him. It turns out she has reported that her son is missing, and the authorities are looking for his whereabouts. This finally makes Nick realize that he may be dead. Sometime later, detectives Kate and Brian begin investigating Nick's sudden disappearance. They observe tire tracks a few meters inside the nearby woods and also see a broken side view mirror of a car lying on the ground. The duo also gets informed about the altercation that took place between Annie and Nick a few days earlier at school. So they head to Annie's home and find her sitting on the roof. Detective Brian, who once used to work with Annie's father, asks if she has seen Nick recently. She lies that she hasn't seen him since they argued in school. Brian knows that Annie is going through a tough time because of her father's second marriage and decides to let her off the hook. "You probably killed that kid, but it's fine. I feel bad for you." He simply asks her to contact them if she finds anything suspicious before leaving her alone. In the meantime, a search party is formed to look for Nick in the woods. Where the hell is Pete in all this anyway? Elsewhere, Nick, who has accepted that he is now dead, is in his room pondering what to do. He soon notices a beautiful bird on the porch railing right outside the room. The bird seems to be gravely injured and is about to die when a live bird suddenly appears on his shoulder. It looks exactly like the injured one, and Nick grabs it in his hand, but the live bird disappears at the same moment when the injured bird dies on the porch outside. This finally makes Nick realize what's happening. He is not dead, but is having an out-of-body experience. His spiritual form will vanish once he actually dies in the real world. Meanwhile, Detective Brian visits Marcus in his garage and inquires about the jewelry shop robbery. Marcus says he has no idea about the incident and lies that he was working here, but the detective isn't fully convinced and asks Marcus to call the police station if he meets Annie. Later that day, a nervous Marcus stops Pete on the street and informs him that he is being pursued by the cops. The duo return to the woods where Nick was last seen. They then quietly take out Nick's body from the storm drain and take it to a different location. Following this, Marcus decides to get rid of Annie once and for all, as he believes she is getting out of hand. He asks to meet her near a train station, but says that he simply wants to talk to her. Annie, in turn, calls Peter to the meeting place as well, completely unaware that he is being tailed by the police. Sometime later, all three of them arrive at the designated spot. Marcus immediately makes his intentions clear and pulls a gun on Annie. He then orders Pete to keep his mouth shut and allows him to go back home. But at this moment, several cops arrive at the location. Annie takes advantage of the distraction and snatches the gun from Marcus before running away to safety. Nick, who had arrived with the cops, yells that they will catch her, and to his utter surprise, she responds by shouting "never." It is obvious that Annie can hear Nick to a certain degree, despite not being able to see him. The next day, she arrives at Nick's home. After spending the night in the school gym, she sneaks into his room and looks at his childhood photographs. Gradually, she begins to realize that Nick was not too different from her. After all, they both grew up in a broken household and faced similar problems, like emotionally distant parents. They also both knew where Nick lived, apparently. The fact that she killed him in a fit of rage begins to weigh heavily on her conscience. But before Annie can learn more, she is forced to run away when Nick's mother suddenly arrives in the room. She dashes out into the woods to the spot where she last saw Nick. To her utter horror, Annie cannot find his body under the storm drain. She does, however, discover a nicotine gum pack nearby, which makes her believe that Marcus had also come here. Soon, Annie tracks down her boyfriend and drags him to a ledge at gunpoint. Marcus eventually admits that he had moved Nick's body from its previous position. It is now lying on the foot of a nearby dam, which will open in about half an hour. Upon hearing this, Annie tries to leave, but Marcus, who is hiding a gun, shoots her in the stomach. Annie responds and shoots back, hitting him on the shoulders. She is gravely injured, but manages to call Detective Brian and tells him where Nick's body is. Soon afterwards, the police arrive at the local dam and manage to locate Nick just in time. He is immediately brought to the hospital, where he is admitted to the ICU. Nick may have been rescued from the freezing water, but his life is still hanging by a thread. He's not dead? What? On the other hand, Annie, who is bleeding profusely due to the gunshot wound, stumbles into the hospital. Her conscience is heavy, and she wants to repent for all the horrible deeds she has done. So, she walks into the ICU, where Nick is being kept, and begs him for forgiveness. Annie lies down by his side, and slowly, Nick's spirit returns to his own body. Unfortunately, by this point, Annie has lost too much blood, and she eventually succumbs to her injuries. Her final act was to save the very person whom she hated only a few days ago. The movie comes to an end as Nick visits Annie's brother Victor a few weeks later and plays with him.